Pick me up, help me to drink this bitter cup, till I reach that home in glory. Stand by me, stand by me, Lord, yeah. While I walk this lonesome road, stand by me, Lord, yeah. Help me to bear this heavy load. And if I stumble, pick me up, help me to drink this bitter cup. Stood by my father and my mother, stood by my sister, Jesus and my brother. It was amazing, Lord, how you kept me. It was your grace, Lord, that brought me. Great Redeemer, oh Lord, stand by me, stand by me, Lord, stand by me, while I walk this lonesome road. Stand by me, Lord, stand by me, help me to bear this heavy load. If I stumble, pick me up. Well, stood by my father and my mother, stood by my sister, Jesus and my
brightly beams our Father's mercy from his lighthouse evermore. But to us he gives the keeping of the lights along the shore. Let the lower lights be burning, send a gleam across the way. Some poor fainting, struggling seaman, you may rescue, you may save. Dark the night of sin has settled, loud the angry billows roar. Eager eyes are watching, longing for the lights along the shore. Let the lower lights be burning, send drowning, struggling seaman, you may rescue.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see everybody out today. See the Cochran family survived their first ever Bridge Day. That's the first time y'all been to that? What was your, all right, nice to see everybody out this morning. We'll go ahead and get ready for our Sunday school class. Before we do that, we'll go ahead and go to prayer this morning, and we'll ask kind of a small crowd today. Anybody anywhere, if you got a spoken request? All right, Steve. Yes, sir? All right. Ruby? All right. Somebody else? John?
Remember Aaron, Cody Moore in prayer.
All right. Anybody else? Was spoken request anywhere? All right, I'm sure everyone here has unspoken prayer requests. Let's all stand if you would, please. Let's try to remember each other's requests, and as always, let's remember to invite God into our service. That's what we're here for. John, do you mind leading this morning, please?
Heavenly Father, we are just
Heavenly
grateful
Father, thank you this morning, Lord, for this day that you've given us. Thank you, Lord, for this privilege and opportunity you've allowed each of us to come into your house, Lord, to lift up the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, and offer up our praise and worship. Father, we ask as always that you'll forgive us when we sin against you, fail you, Lord, and one another so often. We pray that you would just forgive us for these, help us to move forward and draw closer to you every day. Lord, I just ask that you would hear the prayer requests that are going up this morning. Keep your hand on each of those, Lord. Pray that you would answer those in their holy will, but most importantly, Lord, let us all feel the peace and comfort that we can come together and follow you. Lord, we just ask that you would guide the rest of Sunday school this morning, not just in this class, but all the other ones represented this morning. We keep all the ears attuned and hearts open for each one of us, Lord, that we might study your word closer to you through it. Father, we just ask for your blessings, your guidance this morning, Lord. Let us all be obedient to your holy word. In Jesus' name we ask these things.
Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in heaven as on earth. And give us day by day our daily bread. And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Amen. All right, before we start on our lesson this morning, I'll ask if anyone has read a passage or a verse you'd like to share with the rest of us this morning. Okay, Bruce.
Now, this is out of Second Chronicles, chapter 33, and I'm going to start here at verse 3. For he built again the high places which Hezekiah his father had broken down, and he reared up altars for Balaam, and made groves, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven, and served it. Also he built altars in the house of the Lord, whereof the Lord had said, in Jerusalem shall my name be forever. And he built altars of all the hosts of heaven, and the two courts of the house of the Lord. And he caused the children to pass through the fire and the valley of the son of Haman. Also he observed times, and used enchantment, used witchcraft, and dealt with familiar spirit, and with wizards. He wrought much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. And he set a carved image, the idol of which he had made in the house of God, of which God had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen before all the tribes of Israel, I'll put my name forever. Neither will I any more remove the foot of Israel from out of the land, which I have appointed for your fathers, so that they will take heed to do all that I have commanded them, according to the whole law and the statutes and the ordinances ordinances by the hand of Moses. May God add a blessing to the reading of his holy word.
Amen. Thank you, Bruce. All right, anybody, if you come across something that speaks to your heart, addresses something going on with you, and if you care to share it, consider writing it down and reading it for us. I'd like to take a few minutes to do that for Sunday school. All right, we'll go ahead and get into our lesson this morning. The title of it is Testimony. Obviously, we're still in the book of Acts. We're in the 21st chapter this morning. Excuse me, I got a lingering cough here. One of the greatest blessings of our church, I believe, is, and I can say that because I haven't been in a whole lot of churches, so I compare this church, is being able to openly testify or give a testimony and hear the testimonies of others. Who gets a blessing from hearing testimonies of others? Yeah. So we need to think about that. Other people probably would get a blessing from hearing our testimony, for those of us who don't like to stand up and give testimonies. So we might kind of want to keep that in mind. What is a testimony exactly? Anybody?
You're sharing with others.
Okay. Anybody?
It's a praise unto God.
Okay.
What God has done to you.
All right. You know, obviously I don't ask these questions unless I look up some answer, have some answer, because I don't want to appear any stupider than I have to be. So I looked it up, and you know, it's a word that we use a lot. And sometimes when there's words that we use a lot, especially in church, we don't really consider what it means or what it came from, the root of the word or any of that stuff. So a lot of times I like to read and see, you know, exactly what does it mean, especially how it relates to what we're doing in church. And everybody's given an answer that is exactly spot on. The definition of the word is a formal, written, or spoken statement, especially one given in a court of law. That's number one definition for a testimony. Now, we're obviously not in a court of law, so how does that apply to church based on that definition? Anybody? So, you know, we are, as opposed to a court of law, we're doing it among our peers, our brothers and sisters, especially that spoken statement, okay? And that's basically what it is. It's a formal spoken statement. It could be written, but that's not all it is. You know, I'm sure that everybody knows here, most of the words that we use, especially in the English language, they have multiple definitions, or at least variations of the definition, still tied back to that original root word, right? So if you read the list of definitions far enough, you'll also read, like basically what Brother Eddie said, a public recounting of a religious conversion or experience. So basically, when we give testimony in church, the way we relate to it, the way we think about it, is we are publicly declaring what God has done for us, or something that has happened in our lives, something that's going on with us that we can directly see the hand of God in action, right? That's what we consider a testimony in church. That's the kind of thing we're doing. And we here at the Gospel Chapel, you know, we often give or hear testimonies giving during our devotional time of our service. We sort of set aside a time for people to be able to stand up and give a testimony or testify to what the Lord has done for them over the last week, or whatever you want to talk about. So we sort of have a set time. When is the appropriate time to testify as to what God has done for you? Anytime, thank you. Really, we should be doing that all the time. Testimonies are not something that, and I'm not criticizing our service at all, it's just a time that we try to encourage people, you know, because people need a little kick or a nudge now and then to stand up, to speak out loud and say something along that. And it's very easy when we're in church, isn't it? To speak of the things of God like Christians, right? Very easy to do. You sort of have to sit and think, now, how often do we do that outside of church? Sit and talk about the things that God has done for us among people who are not our fellow Congregationalists. But testimonies, publicly sharing experiences in your Christian faith, is a great way to share your faith, right? it's almost, and I don't want to gauge it as a level of faith, but it's a public demonstration of your faith if you are willing to publicly stand up and make a statement as to something that you've experienced or something that you've seen God do for you. And it's equally as important to hear those from others and see what God is doing in the lives of others, isn't it? When we give and hear testimonies, we're sort of lifting each other up, are we not? Now, obviously, this is done to glorify God, because all the attention is look what God did, not look what I did, or look what God did because of me, but look what God has done in my life, and I want to share that with you all. And when people hear those things, they feel good. And when you hear them from other people, you feel good. We love to see God's blessings in action, don't we? We like to see God at work in people's lives. It's very uplifting for all of us. And I think the more that we hear those, the more that we share those, our faith increases. We all have this measure of faith, and then it grows. It's like anything else. If you exercise something enough, it grows, right? So, when we think of testimonies, we typically think of them, as we've discussed, in terms of a public declaration, right? I stood up and I said something. Something came out of my mouth, and that's what we think of as a testimony. But is that all there is to testimonies, standing up, speaking to already like-minded believers about God's blessings in your life? Is that all there is to a testimony?
I think it's also a test of our faith.
Okay. All right.
It's a show of your actions.
Speaks much louder than the words, doesn't it? Speaking is great. And the fact that we get to a point where we are willing, we overcome whatever interferes we have and reservations, and when we can stand up and we can share with other people what God has done for us is great. It really is. It's a very powerful thing. But there's an even more effective way of showing and sharing your faith. Another way to testify. And that's by living it. Right? How we live our lives every day gives testimony of our faith. Right? It's, we always hear, giving lip service, that kind of stuff comes out of the mouth. It's easy to speak things from your mouth. The oral testimonies, the spoken testimonies are great. But do we live like we truly believe what we stand up and proclaim during a testimony? Okay?
Mine was told that those who don't practice what they preach is hypocrites.
That's
Exactly right. It's one of those things where it's easy to stand up, and you'll hear most testimonies start out, I want to stand up today and say I love the Lord. How many of you have heard that right off the bat? That's the way a testimony starts. Nothing wrong with that. What did Jesus say? If you love me,
Keep my commandments.
you will keep my commandments, right? So, in other words, live like I told you to live. Basically, that's what that boils down to. So, we have to think, do we actually live like we truly believe what we're claiming or proclaiming? Do we actually live like we truly believe what we're claiming or proclaiming when we give a spoken testimony? Is what comes out of our mouths testimony to what God means to us, both in and out of church? You understand? So that's why the testimony of the way we live our lives has so much more effectiveness as a testimony than just speaking on Sunday mornings when we come in and we stand up and give a spoken testimony. You have to think, do our day-to-day activities line up with our faith, or at least what we claim? That's the real test of faith. Not just the standing up and giving the testimony on Sunday morning, which is great, not knocking that, but how we live our lives when we're not in here giving a spoken testimony. The testimony of our lives, does it line up with what we're talking about here? So, the harsh reality is, if the testimony of our daily lives our daily living doesn't match up with our spoken testimony in church, which one do you think is going to speak louder? The actions, what people are seeing, right? So which is going to have a bigger, you have to think, and testimonies are great. They might influence someone else. They could have an impact on someone else's life, which we all hope for, right? But if the day-to-day living doesn't match with that, that's going to speak far louder than what I say here on Sunday morning about what God means to me. If I'm living a totally different way outside of the church walls, it doesn't really reflect that what came out of my mouth is what's important to me. So anyway, in our lesson this morning, the Apostle Paul is the center of some controversy again. It's funny when you read through the book of Acts, it's like, man, this guy's always in the middle of something. And he is, again. And in this lesson, we're going to see how important it is that what you do in front of others is more important than what you say in front of others. And we'll read through this, we'll talk about it, and I encourage everybody, if you got a comment as we got through here, please don't be bashful today. If you've got the booklet, this is on page 43. Again, it's taken out of Acts 21. We're going to read verses 17 through 26. I'll read the first verse, you guys read after me, and then we'll go back and talk about them. It says in verse 17, "And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly.
In the day of calling all men
And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And they were informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. Do therefore this that we say to thee, we have 4 men which have a vow on them. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Amen. All right. So, if you've been, and I'm going to just take some information out of these first 4 verses here, and we'll talk about a little background stuff before we go on. If you've been following along with the lessons this quarter, Paul has been busy, right? He has been traveling, preaching, teaching, establishing churches, helped build up the churches all over the region. Some by boat, by walking, by this and that, and all this stuff. But he has been a very busy man. And, most of the book of Acts deals with, the facts after Paul's conversion and then the beginning of his ministry and the things that he's done during his ministry. After his own conversion, just to kind of give us an illustration of how energetic Paul is about spreading the gospel, he threw as much energy into the gospel of Jesus Christ as he had in persecuting followers. How zealous was he at that? Very much so. He was what I would call a hardcore Jew, right? He was well versed in Jewish law, and I don't believe he was necessarily a religious leader, but he was one of those guys that lived by the law, by the religious the customs, the rites, the Jewish, all of that stuff that was going on. And he was, the way he approached that when this whole Jesus thing started up, and, you know, we got to put an end to this, right? And he threw all of his energy into doing that. He was very, just forward about it. He would take place in, you know, arrests, persecutions. You know, we knew that, you know, he kind of held the coat when Stephen was being stoned. He was there when all this is going on. So he took a very active role in being a problem to these new Christians. Of course, they weren't called Christians yet, but we'll use that for now. But he threw as that, so when after his conversion, that same zeal that he approached persecuting Christians, he threw into spreading the gospel, which was great. God doesn't make mistakes, right? Picked the right guy for the job here. Took what we would consider the worst person to do this and became probably one of the most successful evangelists of our time. But this was not without some setbacks, was it? It wasn't all smooth sailing when he decided, you know, after his conversion, now I'm going to spread the gospel of Jesus. He had some issues, did he not? What kind of things did he go through?
He had to win over the Christians that were afraid of him.
That was one of the first things, yeah, to get some credibility for people to listen to him. Anybody else?
Took a lot of persecution.
A lot of persecution. He was beaten. He was arrested. He was threatened with death at many times. We've looked at some of them already, and you know, as we go through it for his entire ministry, Paul had issues, right? There are spreading the gospel, especially in this time when he was you know, actively preaching, teaching, traveling, and all this. It was not an easy thing. It wasn't one of those, you know, we take a lot of get arrested. I could get beaten. I'm not saying it never goes on, but I can be pretty comfortable that it's not going to happen to me, right? Not today. What's that, Donna? Right now. You're right. Thank you. But Paul had some pretty serious setbacks. So let's think about this. So what do we know about Paul's testimony up to this point of this lesson?
It was in contrast to what it was to begin with.
Yes, it was exactly opposite. You know, one of the things that we see here is once Paul, you know, first he's persecuting, now he's preaching and help leading so many people to Jesus. And in spite of the obstacles that he faced, which were serious obstacles, okay, I think that any one of those things might be enough to say, maybe I'm not ready for all that. I'm just being honest. If somebody was threatening to kill you because you said something about Jesus, would you continue? Would you do it as vocally as you had? Would you maybe be a little more discreet about things? You don't have to answer any of that. Paul did not let these obstacles hinder him one bit, did he? We don't have evidence anywhere that what he preached and how he lived ever contradicted each other. He's preaching the gospel, and he's also living by God's word. We don't see any place that his testimony, whether it was oral or whether it was his daily living, ever contradicted the other. We don't see that he caved in to the threats. He didn't succumb to, until he was finally executed, he never kept his mouth shut. He continued to do it. When he was in jail, he was preaching to the jailers, right? To the other people that were locked up, criminals. He never stopped what he was doing.
There's kind of a message I'm getting here, you know, in the lesson. Maybe one of the things Paul was trying to say to the Jews about the Gentiles is, we're not to hurt those that don't hate.
Okay, all right.
That's a message I'm kind of getting, you
Yeah.
know. Because they was talking like that they was going to have to be circumcised and converted like them, you know.
Right.
And I think that's what Paul was trying to say. Well, you're not to hurt them, but they don't have.
You know, you have to sit back and think. If Paul wasn't practicing what he was preaching, how do you think things might be different today? Now, I believe God's will is going to be done regardless, period, okay? But how do you think things might be done if Paul's preaching and Paul's life did contradict each other? How do you think that might have impacted, I mean, even us?
Gospel might be a little more loosely.
Okay. You know, and again, I think that God's will would have been done, period. And it continues to be done every day. The gospel message goes out. There are still conversions taking place every day, and it will continue because that's God's will. But do you think that Paul's influence, not the gospel, but Paul's influence might have been a little different if Paul's personal testimony, the way he lived his life, didn't match up with what came out of his mouth, right? There might have been fewer conversions at this time because, you know, when Paul preached, he was apparently very successful. And we read over and over again where thousands of people were converted after hearing Paul preach or teach, right? There might have been fewer conversions. There might have been slower growth of the church, right? Like John said, maybe things would have got just a little looser as far as, you know, if people weren't paying attention to what this guy Paul had to say. And maybe worship would not look like what it does today. Don't know. We don't have any idea what the outcome of that might have been. And again, I think that's testimony. God doesn't make mistakes. God picked the right guy, directed him, he was obedient, and we have a pretty nice picture of the way things turned out. But it didn't have to be that way. It just goes to show how important that, you know, living your life or the way you conduct yourself actually lines up with what you're telling people. At any rate, in these first 4 verses of where we are in Acts 21, where it starts at 17 there, Paul and company, and I don't know who all was with him, there was several with him traveling, have come back to Jerusalem. Now, Paul had been warned prior to this, you probably shouldn't go back there. There's going to be problems. There's problems everywhere he goes. But he had been told, because Paul had been, if you remember, had been preaching. He finally got to a point where he got very frustrated with trying to preach to the Jews. The opposition, the flat hard-heartedness, and all this stuff. You know what? I'm going to preach to the Gentiles. And that's what he started doing. It didn't win him a lot of friends among the hardcore Jewish leaders. All right, so he had been warned it's probably not a good idea to come back to Jerusalem right now, but he came anyway. So he comes back to Jerusalem, and I'm just kind of recapping these first 4 verses here, 17 through 20. So they came, and he met up with James and some of the other elders in Jerusalem at this time. And Paul takes, here we go now with a spoken testimony. And it says, in verse 19 there, it kind of just says exactly what we've been talking about. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. What did Paul just do in front of James and the elders? Gave a testimony, right? He stood up and he talked about what God has been doing, particularly among the ministry to the Gentiles, his preaching to the Gentiles, right? So he took that opportunity to testify about God's work, spoken testimony. Now, Paul was excited about this. You're not going to give a testimony or testify about something that you're not excited about, right? I mean, if something was kind of ho-hum to you and it didn't make much impact, you're not going to stand up and talk about it a whole lot. This obviously excited Paul, what was going on. Because again, Paul is a very zealous guy. He's very headstrong on what he's doing. But while he was excited about this, it might not have been the case among some of the elders. Why not? Why would the elders back at Jerusalem not have been excited to hear this news about the Gentiles? Some of them.
Prejudice.
Okay?
Anybody else?
They were guilty of what he was talking about.
Yes, there was a lot of that. You know, there's still that old guard among the Jewish community, the older Jewish leaders, religious people, and they were very thoroughly convinced that unless you were a Jew, God wasn't for you. You were not part of the family of God. You are not a child of the God that they worship. Gentiles, yes, and that's the way they described them. And so you were less than a human being if you were not Jew. So Paul met with kind of a mixed reception about talking and being so excited about these people that had been converted because of the ministry, and how successful and how open the Gentiles were to hearing this message and accepting it and accepting Jesus Christ. He's excited.
You know, back years ago, I looked up dogs, you know, in Webster's dictionary, and it says a dog's an animal. It also says that a dog could be a mean, worthless person. That was the definition in Webster's dictionary of it.
Okay. All right. Let's look at the next three verses together, 20 through 22. I'll read them real quick. Three verses together, 20 through 22. I'll read them real quick. It said, now again, this is talking about right at the end of Paul's testimony, talking about the success he's had with the Gentiles. It says in verse 20, and when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. And they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. All right, so Paul gave his testimony. What was the response to that? First part of verse 20. They glorified the Lord. That was great. To James and the elders, they were excited to hear this. They glorified God over this, right? But there were still some mixed thoughts and some mixed feelings, and you can see that coming out through here. The elders pointed out, you know what? There are thousands of converted Jews that are still very mindful of Jewish law. We got to deal with this. That's kind of what I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But there were some mixed emotions, mixed feelings about what Paul's telling them about the Gentiles. They're just reminding him, hey, you gotta keep in mind there's thousands of Jews that have converted, but they're all still very zealous of the law. They were having a hard time with this whole grace over law thing, right? And the balance thereof. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. And they're reminding him, you've got to remember, word had arrived in Jerusalem before Paul got there that he was preaching that they should forsake the Jewish law. That's the word that came back. That's what they're saying. That they could forsake the laws given by Moses, especially a ceremony as important as circumcision. To the Jewish community, I mean, this was probably the most important rite that a male could do to show their faith, their commitment to God, is circumcision. We cannot bypass that, right? That was Jewish law. And here you are, you're going out there and you're telling people it's not necessary. You don't even have to do that. There's other customs too. You're telling people we don't have to do that. Well, again, the old guard Jews, they're really concerned about that. You're preaching against the law and telling people they don't have to do the law? Was that true? Is that what Paul was teaching? See, that's another part of, our testimonies, the testimonies of our lives, testimony of what comes out of our mouth, really have to match up. Number one, that's not what Paul taught. And if we go back and look at this, and then some more trouble follows up after our lesson this morning. I don't know if it's part of Tim's lesson for next week or not, but I didn't read ahead, but there's more trouble to do with this. But Paul wasn't teaching that. That's not what he was teaching people. There was a little bit of truth in that, but they, once again, because it wasn't their plan, what they wanted to hear, it kind of got skewed and went haywire. What Paul actually taught was that if the Jews were convicted to practice circumcision, fine, do so. That's fine. However, the Gentiles who never practiced that custom, you know what? If you don't want to, don't. It doesn't impact your salvation one way or the other. Whether you observe this custom or whether you don't. That has nothing to do with Jesus in your heart, right? That's what he taught. But that's not what got back. So what got back was, man, he's preaching against the law. He's telling everybody you don't have to follow the law. Oh, Moses gave us that law. You're talking about Moses, which is, blasphemy to them, to the Jews. So this council of elders wanted to know, so which is it? What are you going to tell everybody? They know you're here. What are you going to say so we can put this matter at rest? And that's basically what they were asking Paul at this point during this. Trouble just seemed to follow Paul wherever he went. It's a shame, and I think that's testament of how hard the devil will work to try to quell people from coming to faith in the Lord by, I'll take that down, we're going to stop this, whatever. Didn't work quite that way, but again, Paul just seemed to have all kinds of issues wherever he went.
It says if we speak a word against God or a word against the Holy Ghost, that sin will not be forgiven in this world, in the world to come. But if we speak against the Son of Man, that'll be forgiven. That's some scripture I read years and years ago back in my younger days. I still remember reading those scriptures.
Yeah.
Brother Mark,
Yes, sir.
isn't that what Satan done to Eve in the garden?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Same thing, take a little bit of truth and make it look like something else.
Yeah, did you know that? I believe what the Satan used on Eve. He was the serpent was Satan, and the serpent was one. What he used on Eve was deception.
Yeah.
I was told a long time ago that deception is witchcraft. So the serpent used witchcraft on her and deceived her.
All right, so we'll move on to the next couple of verses, 23 and 24. I'll take those two together. It says, "Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Take them and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also workest orderly, and keepest the law." So the elders came up with a plan to try to appease the mob. Okay, let's keep everybody happy. There were 4 men that were about to fulfill some vow to God. We don't know what it is. It doesn't make any difference for our lesson this morning. But they basically wanted Paul to go ahead with these 4 men and go through the cleansing process with them as they are going about fulfilling whatever this vow is. We want you to go through the cleansing process, the rituals, according to Jewish law, which Paul is very familiar with. This is the way he grew up. And that is going to ensure everybody that Paul wasn't simply foregoing the law. Now, I'm going to ruin the end of the story here. We find out in verse 26, Paul did do what they suggested. He did go through the purification and the process with these 4 men as a public testimony that there were Jewish customs to follow. Okay? Let me ask you this. This is certainly an opinion. Do you think Paul did the right thing by following through and going through the customs, the Jewish customs of purification? It's easy for us to judge or sit back, play armchair quarterback and all this stuff. believe it or not, that's, if you look through the commentaries here, that's been a matter of controversy among some Bible scholars for years. People will say, well, Paul did the wrong thing. He shouldn't have done it. He should have just whatever.
Was that kind of a compromise?
I think maybe, it did keep the peace. He did believe in, and Paul was Jewish. I don't think it had anything to do with him not trusting in the Lord in his heart at all. It was, whatever his reasoning was, we don't have his insight. We just know that he did do it. He did go through the purification process with them.
He did fulfill what he was preaching. I mean, if you are a Jew and you feel compelled to it, go for it. But as a Gentile, you don't have to.
Exactly, yeah.
So, again, that's what can
Right.
arise, discretion, so.
Yeah. So, take the last couple of verses here. We're just about out of time anyway here. So, in the last two verses, 25 and 26, and they go on to tell him, so they're asking him, hey, look, to keep everybody at ease, why don't you go ahead and do this? So then it goes on in verse 25. It says, as touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. Okay, so the elders went on to say, look, as far as the Gentiles are concerned, it's not necessary for them to do this. Especially concerning some of the customs like the circumcision, which was the big deal. However, they are still subject, now think about this, but they're still subject to intent of the law. Isn't that something that we're all still, that's where mankind messed up. So we couldn't follow the letter of the law, but aren't we still to follow the intent of the law? The intent of the law, as Jesus said, the commandments, was to do what? What's the intent of the law?
Bring us to righteousness.
That we worship God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and love one another. That's what the law is designed to do. Bring us to God and love one another. That was the intent. Mankind, because we're all attorneys, we dissect everything. Well, if I do this, I can do that. If they do that, well, then they're wrong and I'm right. Right? I mean, and we still do it today. Look at any court drama you see on television. It's all about finding the loopholes. And we all miss the big picture. Why did God give us the law? To bring us to Him. Right? Pretty simple. And how to treat each other. That's what the intent of the law is. So, and that's what the elders, very smartly, did. Look, the Gentiles are not subject to these customs, the circumcision, the other rites, like the vow that these 4 men, whatever it was, are taking. But that doesn't release them from the intent of the law. And they kind of summed this up, and again, I'm paraphrasing, sin, uncleanliness, and immorality. We're never excused from that, are we? I don't care whether you're Gentile, Jew, whatever it is. That's the intent of the law. Stay away from sin. Stay away from things that are unholy. Stay away from immorality. That's what they say here. They worded it, things offered to idols, from blood, from strangled, and from fornication. So,
I was once told that the law was given to us as a schoolmaster, and Jesus said He come not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And all of our righteousness is nothing but filthy rags before the Lord.
yeah.
This came up prior, our very first lesson in this quarter, in chapter 15, verse 20. But we write unto them that they abstain from pollution of idols and fornication, from things strangled from blood.
Yeah.
So this has been an ongoing, and here it is again.
Yeah. And it comes up again after all this. So not to ruin the story if this is the story for next week, but Paul did all this, went through that. Then they got mad at him and locked him out of the temple after all this is over with. So anyway, so what can we take from this? The way Paul's living his life, the things Paul says. I think Paul lived his life according to what he said. The things that Paul said gave testimony of the things of Jesus. The things that Paul did in his life showed it was a testimony of his faith, was it not? Because he practiced what he was preaching. You know, and I know we started out this way, and I'm just going to kind of sum up. We're out of time here. Our public testimonies are great. God is glorified anytime that we share Him, we share our faith in Him with others, and we hear the same thing from other people. I think it's wonderful that we do that. But what's more effective, who knows how many more fold than what comes out of our mouth, is the way that we live our lives. Does the way we live line up with what we're saying? Are we walking the walk or just talking the talk? One or the other. And it's so important. You know, we think about that testimony here at church. Again, great. But think about when we talk about our daily living and the testimony of our lives, our daily lives. Who all are you speaking to?
Everybody sees you.
Everybody around you. Think of that audience. It could be someone you're not even aware is watching what you're saying, what you're doing, the way you're acting, the way we're living. We should probably always be very aware of our testimony of our lives. All right, I'm out of time, guys. I appreciate it. I'll sit down and shut up.